About a month and a half ago, I was going through the files. I came across the name Ciardi, which I mispronounced 14 times. And in there it said, title of speech, please express your wishes or something. So I wrote a letter to Mr. Ciardi at the Saturday Review. I said, speak on what you would like to speak on. So I think he's chosen a very apt title for his work today. The Poet in America, Mr. Ciardi.
Mr. Boxer, dear sunburnt friends of poetry, I always feel two-minded about poetry and the universities. For 20 years I tried to teach school, and I ended up schizophrenic, as if I had two heads. With one head I tried to write some poetry, and with another head I tried to teach it. And it's a little, as I say, a little schizophrenia. My skits and my phrenia would get into arguments with one another. The atmosphere of the classroom seemed to me to be wrong for the thing. I wish we could all go to the local tavern to talk about poetry, or take a walk in the country. Because I think the classroom owes an apology to poetry. You have to remember that a poem it can be light, it can be easy, and I'm all in favor of a light kind of seriousness. Who was the Frenchman that said angels can fly because they take themselves lightly? It's a good thought. I don't like the heavy-handed, serious approach to seriousness. I think there's a much more viable, light approach to seriousness. What Robert Frost said when he said, only where love and need are one and the work is play for mortal stakes. All of it. It's not just play. The work is play, and for mortal stakes. Then you're engaged in it. But you see, a poem is some sort of act of passion. And heaven knows I don't want the classroom to become a scene of passion. There are enough things wrong with it now, but you have to remember it. You have to touch electricity. And I'm not sure it's done when you're discussing Romanticism or history of ideas, or whether or not there are any Neoplatonic influences in the Ode on the Intimations of Immortality, or textual criticism of Shakespeare, or the source work, where did he get the plot of Macbeth? All these things have their place. But if they serve as insulation for the passion of poetry rather than as a way of getting the juice conducted to the right place, I think they destroy the process. It's true that most of the poets nowadays, except for the Beats, are making their living in the universities. There's a great deal of talk about the distinction between the Beats and the academics. I don't trust that distinction. Somebody made it another way. They spoke of the made and the unmade poets. I think by analogy to a bed, the made and the rumpled poets. The main difference I see between most of the beat poetry and the academic poetry that comes along is the academic poets have read something. An impassioned ignorance, I don't think, is the best approach to the instrument. There is a tradition. I don't think you can play music until you've heard music. I think that writing a poem involves at least as much skill as being a concert pianist, and that means spending some time at the instrument. Kerouac, in his write-up for the Celebrity Register, had some things to say about his writing habits, and I think they describe a number of beat poets. He puts a roll in the typewriter, not a sheet. And he said, and then I type 8 to 10 feet a day. And I never change anything. These are his words. I may be misquoting part of a word, but the sentiment is exact. I never change anything because exactly what you would be tempted to change, that's what would be most interesting to your doctor. Well, I think that misconceives the reader. It certainly misconceives me as any reader. If I'm going to be charged with psychoanalyzing Jack Kerouac, I want to be paid at least $50 an hour. And that's not what I read for. The argument is often, don't you lose the impromptu if you revise? You don't get the impromptu unless you revise. You write it into position. Good writing is rewriting. Yeats was wonderful on that score, and a great poem of his called Adam's Curse. He says, "A line may take us hours, may be, yet if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been naught. Better get down upon your marrow bones and scrub a kitchen pavement or break stones like an old pauper in all kinds of weather, for to articulate sweet sounds together is to work harder than all these, and yet be thought an idler by the noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, and clergymen the martyrs call the world." It's a nice act of letting go, you know. I think he had the right enemy located in a way. As far as the force and the vitality of poetry goes. But then, if this were a captive audience, I'm glad it isn't. Although I make my living from captive audiences, I don't sneer at those either. That's an academic profession. I could say something else. All students tend to be a little sneaky about poetry. Partly because of the academic pressures, all but the really good ones. Because the average and the slow students don't really care about the poem. They want to know what to put on the final examination. You see, they're just going over hurdles. They won't engage a confusion. They want a certifiable answer, which is what my teachers used to do when they got out of the wrong end of the teaching process. My school teachers, not college teachers, would say, "In 2 good sentences that make sense, state the meaning of this poem." I say, "Wow, there goes Keats, there goes Blake, there goes all the wildness." It's instruction to translate, isn't it? Rewrite this poem the way the poet would have written it in the first place had he been as smart as the school system, without fooling around with rhymes, with metaphors, with images, with shapes, without any of the things you love in poetry. No, that's not a good enough reason. So, I don't want to talk to categorical readers. They're spiritually poor. They have the courage of their convictions, but they haven't got the courage of their confusions. And I don't think you're being educated unless you're taking the venture into confusion. You have to. You can't get entirely clarified. You can't get it all down into 2 sentences that make sense. I've been asked time and again by deuce ladies, why is modern poetry so crazy? And there are a lot of answers to that, but I don't know quite how I scored with them, but I gave myself some points one day when I said, well, I'll tell you what, you sit there in a Quaker meeting and think back to the last really vivid dream you had. And now set it out as if it were a screen treatment, you see. And then just study this scenario, and then ask yourself, who wrote it? Now, was it put together by some communist homosexual poet on the left bank of the Seine? Or did it come out of your 100% American psyche? The fact is, we're all crazy. As soon as we take attention off our conscious minds, an ape behind the brain begins to yammer, what Aldous Huxley called the endless idiot gibberish of the reverie. We're all ridiculous when we're not being careful not to be. The kinds of things that go through our heads when we're not guarding ourselves consciously. And poetry has to be about that too. It has to awaken the whole system. But certainly one of the things I feel about the position of the contemporary poet is that there are more 19th century readers than there are 20th century readers. And you have the situation of 20th century poetry and 19th century readers who are looking for categorical affirmations. They begin by confusing the subject matter with the act of the poem. And I think I'm ready to say that I don't care what a poem says. I'm concerned at what depth it awakens the language. I want to see an act of language. And if that act of language is sufficiently impassioned and good, it will come to human consequence. It has to. But over and over again, people think that the subject is what makes the poem. I had a lovely exchange with I guess a lady at the Ciardi Review. She wrote on She wrote on blue letter paper, vaguely scented, with a big white monogram, and I guess that makes her a lady. But she wrote a rather snarly letter. I had rejected some poems of hers. I didn't remember them. I have to reject hundreds of poems every week. I get about 600. I can only accept 2. And that there's a certain mathematics at work here. But as I say, I didn't remember her poems, but she wrote in and said, "I suppose you rejected my poems because they're about God." Well, I don't know where she got that notion. She'd been tapping in on some private line of her own. But I usually don't answer my mail. It saves me 4 days out of every week if I throw it away. But this was too good. I had to answer it. I wrote her and said, "Dear Madam, I did not reject your poems because they were about God. I rejected them because I could not conquer a feeling that you were unequal to your subject." It takes a lot to write a poem about the universe, you know. The only man I know that really got away with writing about the universe was Dante. So check yourself before you go for everything at once. It's not an easy job. If you think you're good enough, by all means try it, but make sure you're good enough first. It's better to start with something you can handle, with an active language you can encompass. And see, what you get down to here is, what distinction do you make, speaking metaphorically, between a superb portrait of someone you dislike and a lousy portrait of someone you love? I've just been sitting in the Chancellor's room looking at those photographs, and maybe that's what put it in my mind. But I don't know how you feel about the former chancellors, but the photographer should have been fired. See, it's icky. It's kish. There's a thing wrong with it. But try the analogy to music as one way of stating the poet's situation today. You know, a firmly romantic composer, I won't mention anyone, but maybe Brahms. You get to the end of say a symphonic work, and you have about a 5-minute parade of big chords. They come in, cut-a-thump, 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 and it builds up and builds up and builds up, and finally it comes to rest with a full orchestral tonic. Wham! And everything is resolved and shut, isn't it? Well, stop and think. You have to be awfully sure what universe you're living in before you can get a form that self-sealing. See, the tonic resolution is an act of certainty, I think, psychically. And what if you're uncertain? Supposing Wordsworth had gone back to Tinton Abbey and found a supermarket and shopping center. You see, would his impressions then have come to a tonic resolution? I think he would have had to find another form to express this ironic change of things. A dying fall, a slide out from under. You see, dissonances, disjunction is part of our lives. The tempi of our lives are changed. And you have to have forms that express this, whatever you're talking about. Otherwise, you're not touching the age. But Cleanth Brooks, in his Modern Poetry and the Tradition, had a nice thing to say about the 19th century, and it still clings to the school system all the way through it. The 19th century was a period of high seriousness. I suspect that began partly as a result of deism. If God was impregnated into everything, you were living constantly in a cathedral, you were constantly standing in front of the altar. And therefore, the full organ tone of perfectly high serious prayer seemed to be the tone of poetry in the age. What followed was that 19th century poetry could not stand an incongruity. And so it limited itself. If your life is full of incongruous experiences, and you have a form that won't stand incongruity, you're in trouble. So Shelley would take off on a rapturous strophe, and he got to one, which is the one I'm trying to think of. He's going along so rapturously, and he comes to the line, "Thy lips, oh slippery blisses." And it just falls apart. It won't take that little change in tone. Or put it this way, the 19th century might well go down as the age of flowing black hair. I suspect there were more yards of flowing black hair in 19th century poetry per capita than in any similar period in human history. But you comb all those miles of flowing black hair, the only flea you find is in Robert Burns. Only one in the whole century. You see, Romantic poetry had no way of handling that incongruity. Now, London was not the most sanitary of cities. It had small life forms, and sooner or later they became visible to the lover, but he had to suppress this detail because his form would not let it in. You see, on the card, that's the poetry of high seriousness, and it leads to a simplification. You have to leave out certain things because they break your tone. Whereas the poetry of the 17th century, for example, was always reaching out for disparate and even incongruous elements and pushing them together, and making the poem the result of these incongruities rather than skirting them and avoiding them. So you had a much more complex form, and to me, a much more interesting one. And I think that's why so many 20th century poets, largely led by Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, but they would have done it anyhow, have responded so strongly to the 17th century, and so much less so to the 18th and 19th. Donne, for example, has a poem about a flea, and it ends up as a serious poem. It's a playful but serious poem. He and his wife are lying in bed, and there's a flea that has bitten him and has bitten her, and she reaches out to kill it, and he says, "Stop. This is a symbol of our marriage. Our two bloods are joined in it." He gets away with it. There's no 19th century poet that could leave a stick of seriousness in that poem. And I'd like to illustrate it in another set of terms. You all know Poe's To Helen. Now, To Helen is not really a love poem. It's a poem about the classical ideal, and Helen represents the perfection of classical civilization or Greek civilization. But it's been handled as a love poem so often, and let's say it was 15% a love poem. But note one thing about it. The tone never changes. The man could not get more serious. He begins utterly serious and ends utterly serious. It's all the well of passion throbbing up in the fullest sincerity. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore that gently o'er the perfumed sea the weary, wayworn wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas, long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy Naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are Holy Land. Now, that's not a bad poem by any means. That distinction between glory and grandeur is one that has been justly praised so many times. But if you read that poem, you have to come to one conclusion. Take it as a love poem, and this man has not lived with this woman. There's a sense of remoteness from contact. Supposing I come home some night and my wife is standing in the window niche holding up an agate lamp and no supper going. We have a problem. We've got to get a consultant in and see if we can't get a few things straightened out. I will still love her, I hope, but we have problems. Now, supposing, you see, this is the kind of poem that I think gets presented to kids in high school. And I think it's one of the things that turns them against poetry. Not that it's a bad poem, but that they haven't enough historic imagination to allow for it, and therefore it runs into an emotional block. And they say, what's this about? Silly way to treat a girl. Or to act out. Or if they tried reading this poem to any of their girlfriends, you'd say, what's with you? It doesn't touch the air of reality. There's so much of that in the 19th century. I happen to be passionate about Keats. But supposing I took a poem Keats beginning, I stood tiptoe on a little hill, and tried to present it to American boys. See, the first line would lose them. They don't go around standing tiptoe on little hills, and they tend to be a little bit suspicious of people who do go around that way. and maybe just a bit more suspicious of people who recommend people who go around that way. And you've lost them. If I were fishing for their interest, I think I'd rather read this poem by John Frederick Nims, N-I-M-S. He's a good poet. You might want to quarrel with a thing or two in this poem. I don't find any real quarrel with it. But you see, it's two-tone poetry. It starts in one voice, shifts to another, shifts back, and the voice goes back and forth, back and forth. He begins by kidding the girl. It's tender kidding. It never goes overboard. And just at the moment when he has kidded her enough, with the slightest touch, he turns it serious. But he doesn't want to get too mawkishly serious about it. Just when he feels he's registered enough seriousness, he lightens the tone again. It's a lovely act of balance. And I'll bet this one would work on anybody's girlfriend much sooner than to Helen. It's called Love Poem. My clumsiest dear, whose hands shipwreck vases, at whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring, whose palms are bulls in china, burrs in linen, and have no cunning with any soft thing except all ill-at-ease fidgeting people. You see how sweetly that's turned? In a sense, he's saying, you're worthless except in the things that really count. And what sets out to be kidding turns out to be the tenderest and sincerest compliment, you see. Whose palms are bulls in china, burrs in linen, and have no cunning with any soft thing except all ill-at-ease fidgeting people. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Deftly you steady the drunk clambering on his undulant floor. It's a marvelously woozy line. And you see, the cleverness of the line is what gets him out of the seriousness for the minute, because he said some very sweet and sincere things about her. You see, have no cunning with any soft thing except all ill-at-ease fidgeting people. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Deftly you steady the drunk clambering on his undulant floor. Unpredictable dear, the taxi driver's terror, shrinking from far headlights, pale as a dime, yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars, misfit in any space, and never on time, a wrench in clocks and the solar system. Only with words and people and love you move at ease. In traffic of wit, expertly maneuver, and keep us all devotion at your knees, forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel, your lipstick grinning on our coat, so gaily in love's unbreakable heaven our souls on glory of spilt bourbon float. Be with me, darling, early and late. Smash glasses. I will study wry music for your sake. For should your hands drop white and empty, all the toys of the world would break. So I think that's a much more successful poem if one is fishing for the student's interest, trying to get him excited about poetry. And I think it's truer to his experience. I'd like to read one that doesn't particularly change tone, a comic valentine, really. I'd written so many love poems to my wife, I guess she began to get bored by it. And I wish we hadn't lost the art of the comic valentine. So last February, I decided I was going to reverse the trend, and I wrote this one on marriage as an institution. And I had in mind a medieval drinking song that I think has a marvelous bachelor's epitaph. The song begins, Meum est proposito in taberna mori. It's my goal to die in a tavern. It's my aim in life to die in a tavern. That's a good bachelor's proposition. And I think the husband's epitaph has to be, it used to be my aim in life to die in a tavern. So I had to change it to meum erat proposito in taverna mori. And then mori was going to be the rhyme word, and it's a hard one to rhyme. But I invented a girl's name. You see, if you drop the A from Gloria, you get Glory, a standard nickname. And I had my hour of glory. And also it allowed me to, also I could prove to my wife that I invented the girl's name for rhyme purposes, you see. There was no glory. She had another name. Glory was kind to every cent she took me for. And am I sorry? Though glory and my money went, and I'm back home with Millicent, my legal sniff and scurry, my knob-kneed middling unevent, my meatless Monday curry, my flannel flitch, with whom I will live, alas, forever. Still I had my hour of glory. What did I get for what I spent? One line for this damned monument I shroud in a perpetual Lent. Meum erat proposito in taberna mori. I guess this poem is in two tones. I think it's necessary one. I think one of the poets who has moved me most among my contemporaries, one that I am sure is going to survive, is Theodore Roethke, who died a couple of years ago. A strangely contradictory man. He lived on a kind of sine curve, would have a breakdown every now and then, and depending where you met him on the sine curve, he was just a variety of personalities. But a wonderfully warm man, a huge man. He was once junior tennis champion of the state of Michigan, and even when he got to be about the size of an elephant, he'd play a furious game of tennis. He looked like a bull elephant on the baselines, and you felt that you had to get out of the way as if you were standing on the track with a locomotive when he came at you. Couldn't stand to lose in any athletic event. He just flipped if he lost a point. Great roister doister. He used to collect gangsters. You'd think he was a gangster himself, and yet what a poet. And I tried to get some of his personal quality, which was really marvelous despite its queer surfaces, and yet all that furious, meaningless activity. And then he'd sit down, and the purest kind of bird would fly out of his silence. And you just wondered how this could be one person. And I tried to catch some of that roistering quality of his. It's called Was a Man. Ted Roethke was a tearing man, a slam-bang, wham-dam tantrum from Saginaw in Michigan, where the ladies sneeze at 10 below, but any man that's half a man can keep a sweat up till the freeze gets down to 99 degrees. For the hair on their chests, it hangs down to their knees in Saginaw in Michigan. Ted Roethke was a drinking man, a brandy and a bubbly He wore a roll of fat that ran 6 times around his belly, then tucked back in where it began. And every ounce of every pound of that great lard was built around the very best hooch that could be found in Saginaw, in Michigan. Ted Roethke was an athlete, so it's pronounced in Michigan. He played to win and was hard to beat, and he'd scream like an orangutan and claw the air and stamp his feet at every shot he couldn't make and every point he couldn't take. And when he lost, he'd hold a wake, or damn you for a cheat. Sometimes he was a friend of mine with the empties on the floor, and God, it's fun to be feeling fine and to pour and pour and pour, But just to show we were not swine, we kept a clock that was stopped at 10 and never started before then. And just to prove we were gentlemen, we quit when it got to 9. Ted Retke was a roaring man, a ring-tailed wing-ding yippee-oh. He could out-yell all Michigan and half the Mississippi-oh. But once he sat still and began to listen for the lifting word, it hovered round him like a bird. And oh, sweet Christ, the things he heard in Saginaw, in Michigan. Now Retke's dead. If there's a man awaking, lost and wanting, oh, in Saginaw, in Michigan, he could hear all his haunting, oh, in the same wind where it began, the terrors it could not outface, but found the words of, and by grace of what words are, found time and place in Saginaw, in Michigan. So I'm not sure you could have written that kind of poem in the... And then it's a crazy world. I don't know quite what to make of it. I'm constantly astonished by the discontinuities of our time. I mentioned earlier, supposing Wordsworth had gone back to Tintern Abbey, or Tennyson had gone back to Locksley Hall and found that Tishman had gotten there first, or what have you, he'd have to write a different poem. And I have this one in mind that I want to get said. I can't go back home. The town where I grew up isn't there anymore. Oh, it's physically there, but the overpasses and the underpasses and the developments and so forth, all the fields I used to play in, the clay pit where we used to risk our lives, the places where we used to go coasting have all been filled in, smoothed over, and it's a faceless place now. And this is my something revisited. The only thing I can really go back to is Conrad Hilton. And I call this thing talking myself to sleep at one more Hilton. I think I can find my way around the Hiltons and the Sheratons by now, blindfolded. So that's an environment. But it's not quite the same one as going back to a place where you remembered your childhood and what have you. I have a country, but no town. Home ran away from me. My trees ripped up their white roots and lay down. Bulldozers cut my lawn. All these are data toward some sentiment like money. God knows where it went. There was a house as sure as time, sure as my father's name and grave, sure as trees for me to climb, sure as behave and misbehave, sure as lamb stew, sure as sin, as warts, as games, as a scraped shin. There was a house, a chicken run, a garden, guilt, a rocking chair. I had 6 dogs, and every one was killed in traffic. I knew where their graves were once. Now I'm not sure. The roses used them for manure. There was a house early and late. One day there came an overpass. It snatched the stew right off my plate. It snatched the plate. A whiff of gas blew up the house like a freak wind. I wonder if I really mind. My father died. My father's house fell out of any real estate. My dogs lie buried where time was when time still flowed, where now a slate stiff river loops called Exit 9. Why should I mind? It isn't mine. I have the way I think I live. The doors of my expense account open like arms when I arrive. There is no cloud I cannot mount and sip good bourbon as I ride. My father's house is Hilton wide. What are old dog bones? Were my trees still standing, would I really care? What's the right name for this disease of wishing they might still be there if I went back, though I will not and never meant to? Smash the pot, knock in the windows, blow the doors, I am not and mean not to be what I was once. I have 2 shores 5 hours apart, soon to be 3, and home is anywhere between, sure as the airport limousine, sure as credit, sure as a drink, as the best steak you ever had, as thinking, when there's time to think, it's good enough, at least not bad, better than dog bones and lamb stew. It does, or it will have to do. See, I can't, I can't very well make a tonic resolution out of that, can I? And this one's even more surrealistic in a way. It's called Back Through the Looking Glass to This Side. The crazy world that exists, and heaven knows how it got there. Yesterday, in a big market, I made $7,000 while I was flying to Dallas to speak to some lunch group and back for a nightcap with my wife. A man from Dallas sat by me both ways, the first from Campbell's Soup, the other from some labeled can of his own, mostly water and gold water at that. Captain J.J. Slaughter of Untied Airlines kept us all in smooth air and well and insistently informed of our progress. Miss G. Klaus brought us bourbon on ice and snacks. At the hotel, the lunch grouped and the group lunched. I was, if I may say so, perceptive, eloquent, sincere, then back to the airport with 17 minutes to spare. Captain T.V. Ringo took over with Miss P. Simbus and that Goldwater oaf. We made it to Newark at 9, plus a few minutes lost in skirting cumulonimbus in our descent at the Maryland-Delaware line. Ticker runs late, said the horoscope page. New highs posted on a broad front. So the good guys had won again. Fat, complacent, a check for more than my father's estate in my inside pocket, with the launched group's thanks for a good day's work, I found my car in the lot and poked it into the lunatic aisles of US 1, a good guy coming home, the long day done. I think perhaps there's, well, let me end with a piece of light verse I had some fun with about moose. Actually, it's literary criticism if you want to take it that way. The subtitle is, "To hairy cows, the hairy bull is handsomer than horrible." That's a psychic comment. Bull moose, a beastly and contrary, ornery, horned, humped up and hairy. It seems hard to imagine how a bull moose could attract a cow, but every spring the mooselets come to prove he must attract her some, perhaps because, though hornless, she is just as downright ornery at times, and as humped up as he. She's just as hairy, certainly. Whatever it is that makes him seem the answer to a girl moose dream, he's all the answer Mrs. Moose gets, and every spring, here come the mooselets. It seems just as mysterious to ask what makes him serious about her, but we must allow ladies their secrets. Anyhow, there are the mooselets every spring, proving, if they prove anything, it must be true what Noah knew about the animals 2 by 2. However beastly and contrary, ornery, horned, humped up and hairy, moose, bull, or cow may seem to be to such non-moose as you and me, clearly, whatever first made moose meant to provide them some inducement to shun mere sentimental looseness and yearn for one another's mooseness. Else mooselets would be far and few, and so should I, and so would you.